This is Whiskey Whereabouts. I'm Tim, and this is my bottle of Bunnahabhain 25-year, the contents of which I have transferred into this box. Why would I do this? It was because of the Cork nightmare. My whiskey journey has taken me to Scotland and back. I've explored whiskey education, tastings, and distilleries from Islay to Speyside. And now my journey continues here, with you, on Whiskey Whereabouts. So it was a bit of a journey, but the contents of my Bunnahabhain 25-year bottle made it not into this cardboard box, but into these smaller glass bottles where that whiskey is going to stay for the foreseeable future. And how did we get here? Well, it all started when I finally opened my precious bottle of Bunnahabhain 25-year, and a very, very expensive bottle of whiskey, a very special bottle. And I recently reviewed this bottle on the channel. If you haven't seen that, I'll put the link up here so you can check it out. And I briefly touched on what I'm going to sort of share with you, the story of the Cork problem I had with this bottle. So when I first opened it, I removed it from its very elaborate display box. More on that later. But the foil around the stopper and the top of the sort of neck of the glass of the bottle was intact, like any sort of other bottle. There was an issue with the foil across the top of the cork. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, but it's important that the foil was intact all the way up over the sort of top of the stopper and definitely across where the cork meets the top of the neck. And I pulled the tab like any other bottle, removed it, and when I went to pull the cork for the first time, it pulled free, having split. And this is what remains of the cork as I pulled it from the neck for the first time. The rest of the cork, having been split and pulled free, was intact, wedged in the neck of the bottle, maintaining a seal, and had to be extracted. And we've encountered this problem before with wine bottles. I'm sure you may have encountered this problem with whiskey bottles. And so I attempted to extract the cork with the wine key, corkscrew, and unfortunately, as soon as I sort of tried to break through, wedge that corkscrew into the cork to extract it, it broke apart, falling into the bottle. This is where the problems began. And in retrospect, it probably would have been worth pouring it out of the bottle immediately with some of the cork still wedged in there. Maybe, maybe not. That's not what I did. I attempted to extract the cork so it could be poured cleanly out of the bottle, and in doing so, several small bits, chunks of the cork, fell into this $600 plus bottle of Scotch Whisky floating across the top before I got my first batch of bottles. I had to keep this intact, and so I had to put a different cork stopper in this bottle. And so I had another Bunnahabhain stopper, which is important because the necks on all these bottles are not interchangeable from distillery to distillery, sometimes bottle to bottle. So when you are killing your bottles, when you recycle your bottles and you throw away unnecessary packaging, keep your cork stoppers. Put them aside. That way, when you have a problem like this, you can go to your library of old stoppers and find a Bunnahabhain stopper that fits. This is a Glenmorangie stopper, which is close, but not a perfect fit. What is a good idea for me is to keep the stoppers and then just drop them in an old packaging box from a bottle you killed. Instead of throwing this away, put it in the back of the cabinet or on a shelf. If it's one that you really liked, you want to, or a sort of really higher end bottle, you want to kind of brag that you had, keep the cardboard or the tube, drop your corks in it, put it in the back of the shelf, forget they're there, because when you need them, you will need them immediately, in a pinch. The problem, of course, was that I could not leave these bits of cork in this bottle of whiskey. I wouldn't do it in any bottle of whiskey, but certainly not a special bottle like this one I intend to hang around as long as I can. I want to be able to share this with people, come and visit, bring little samples. This is not one I'm just going to kind of pull off the shelf every couple days and kill that bottle this month. And in light of that, there was no real sort of option of leaving the cork in the whiskey 46.3%, because there's a reason we store bottles upright and not on their side like wine. And the reason is that cork is going to degrade and break down if submerged in that higher proof spirit. And so having bits of the cork completely submerged in the whiskey, in the bottle, was simply going to just set up a situation where that cork is going to degrade. It's going to give off some sort of flavor contaminants. It's going to impact the flavor of this very special whiskey. So that was not an option. So the options had to include separating this whiskey from the cork that was floating around in it. So I thought about this. I knew I had to act quickly. I needed to transfer the contents of the bottle out of the bottle where it was contaminated with the cork. The mesh strainer worked when I poured my first dram into a Glencairn glass, held it up to the light, and it looked like it was free of any little bits of cork. So, transfer the contents through a mesh strainer into another vessel. That was the plan. So, I can't just pull an old bottle, an empty bottle, even if I rinse it out, because I can't risk pouring this into a vessel that had previously held whiskey for fear of any sort of cross-contamination. Again, this whiskey is too special. I've got to preserve it in its original state. Wash out the bottle. How am I going to make sure I get all of the whiskey out without leaving behind soap or even something from the tap water? Some sort of contaminants drying on the inside of the bottle. I wanted a fresh, clean, never used sort of bottle to transfer this into. Other thing that I was worried about was aeration. We don't want to aerate whiskey. We know what happens when you pour that dram. You let it sit, the air works with it, it changes, it opens up, right? There's no closing it back up again. So this is why we don't decant whiskey. Pouring it out is going to churn it up. So I really didn't want to be in a situation where I had a tall 750 ml bottle and I'm pouring from this great height and the whiskey is dropping down, splashing down in the bottom of the second bottle, bubbling, aerating. So my decision was to immediately get overnighted to me from Amazon a set of fresh, smaller bottles. And I got a set of 6 of these, which are the 125s, which would accommodate the full volume of the contents of this bottle. Glass with the good stoppers, right? It's got the little inner sort of lining to make sure that you make a seal. It's not as good as a cork. It's as good as I'm going to get in these circumstances on short notice. So I did it. And what I liked about these was they're much smaller, right? And so I used the biggest funnel I have that would fit in the neck of these smaller bottles because I wanted to minimize the effect of pouring it through a narrow funnel where it comes out in a narrow volume and potentially it's going to bubble and aerate while it sits here dispersing down, waiting to go sort of down through the funnel. So I wanted to try to pour through, but I didn't want to risk any spillage. So I have this nice, really wide funnel I poured at an angle to try to have the contents of this bottle run down the side of the bottle rather than splashing down to the bottom. Very carefully and very methodically through the mesh strainer, which caught a lot of the cork. I am proud to say that I managed to get all of the contents of this bottle into these bottles, which you will notice are empty currently, without spilling anything. So I felt pretty good about myself, and I felt like I had accomplished my mission. Looking down into the original bottle, the bottom was full of gritty cork sediment. So I couldn't go back into this bottle. I will talk later about my decision for the final sort of disposition of this whiskey, but at the time I was already suspecting that it was not going to be practical or wise to try to transfer the contents from these back into this. I rinsed this bottle out, had no choice, and now I've introduced water into the bottle, and it is the original whiskey, so I don't have that risk. But now I've introduced some water. Maybe I've got something drying on the inside of the glass. I'm fairly certain I got all of the sort of visible bits of cork. But I'm happy to say I didn't try to rush the whiskey back in, because I discovered that the job was not finished yet. To my dismay, the next time I poured a dram of this whiskey before my review, I was sort of dipping into the bottle, trying it, taking notes. As I do, I was admiring the quality. You could see how dark when they're lined up like this. This 25-year whiskey, natural color, but partly sherry, more bourbon than sherry we believe, but still had acquired a really nice rich dark color. And as I held it up to the light to admire the color, I saw that the bottle that I had poured my dram out of, it was the bottle, like this bottle, that was not completely full. The last of these bottles that I had filled was the first I poured out of. And so it had most of the bottom of the original bottle, what we might call the dregs. And when I held it up to the light, it was full of tiny cork particles. And the cork breakdown had already begun. It was like bits of sand, and it was full throughout. It was not settled in the bottom. Holding up other bottles, you couldn't see it as much. This was the worst of it, but it means that none of the samples are likely free of these small bits of this cork. And so I still hadn't solved my problem. Could you drink that? Yes. I don't want to. I don't want to sort of ingest little bits of this cork. I don't know what sort of composite they made this cork out of or what it was treated with. But more importantly, I have small bits of this cork material degrading in my 46% whiskey. There's no way that it's going to be free of some sort of influence. The question is just how much. So I did not feel comfortable leaving it in these original bottles. The problem is that now I was going to be required to pour it twice. And the risk of aerating this whiskey was weighing heavily on me. Plus, the mesh strainer had outlived its usefulness. It was no longer able to catch these bits of cork, so I had to consider my options. And some of you watching this probably know what I did. I've used this method in the past. It's one of these. This is an unbleached coffee filter. We're pouring through a filter. It's not ideal. But what's really not ideal is leaving bits of this cork material to degrade in my precious and rare whiskey. As I talked about in my review, this is a very old bottle of this whiskey. It's from 2016, bottle code. They changed the packaging on this 4 or 5 years ago. So this is a very old example, irreplaceable. And I was trying to take as much care as I could to protect the integrity of the contents of this bottle moving forward. So I made the choice to filter it. And so filter it I did. And fortunately, I had a case of these. I didn't use them to begin with because I didn't want to have so many of these small bottles. I thought it'd be more convenient to have like 6 of these. But those became impractical, and I just couldn't wait any longer to ship and order more bottles. So I had a box of these, and I decided to use these fresh new. Again, these have the quality stopper. It's not a stopper, it's just that sort of conical, clear plastic lining inside of the cap to try to make a seal, to try to preserve it. So because these are smaller, we did have to go with the smaller funnel. I got the conical coffee filter, sort of pinched it, and made a sort of system where I could pour from these bottles into these. Now again, I'm going from smaller bottle to smaller. The distance is not great here, but I didn't really need to worry about that splashing and worry about risking that aeration because it's a coffee filter, not an open funnel. And just like when you brew your coffee, drip, 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 it slowly sort of dripped through, gently, drop by drop, into these bottles. I had to buy a whole pack of these, so I changed them out. Every bottle, I changed with a fresh one in case the alcohol was going to degrade this at all. I wanted it to filter it out and capture all of those tiny, tiny little bits that were too fine to be captured by the mesh strainer. And so, with my bottles, checking them against the light, they are clean. It worked for my purposes. This was not ideal. I've done multiple steps here that could potentially have sort of aerated this whiskey, sort of accelerated its aging a little bit. Pouring it twice through into these little bottles, obviously passing through this paper filter on the way. But now I have my set of these smaller bottles with my Bunnahabhain 25 in with very low head space, free of cork bits, where they can be preserved. And now, as I make my way through this bottle, I will do so in stages, meaning the last sample will not have been opened since that pour. It will be sealed with maximum headspace. So there is some potential benefit to this transfer over. And thus, I am going to leave them in these bottles, stored in the box, on a shelf. Is that as fun as having it in the original bottle, especially when it comes in this huge over-the-top display box? No, it is not. But I talk a lot on this channel about how it's not the bottle, it's the liquid. And we're not about packaging. And so the idea of trying to pour this back in here when I've had water in here, there's potentially still little cork bits in here. I don't have an original stopper, so I have to swap out a different Bunnahabhain cork and stopper to seal this. And I have to go another time through pouring from this great height while it splashes down at this big fat bottom Bunnahabhain, wide bottle. It's going to aerate it. It's going to potentially risk it to more contamination. And as I said before, I recently did a video a couple weeks ago following up on an ongoing experiment I've been doing with art bag bottles in terms of the best way to preserve the whiskey long term, the different techniques we use, and how they work on some blind samples. I'll link to that at the end if you haven't checked it out. But the point of bringing that up is that at some point, when the level in this bottle gets low and the years start going by, I'm going to have to take measures to preserve and protect the contents of this bottle anyway. I've already done that now. The choice has been made for me. I'm going to have it in these smaller bottles where there's very little headspace, preserved better than leaving it at a low level with a lot of air in the bottle. I don't know exactly what happened here, but I have some ideas and I have some suspicions. So, as I said, this is a very old bottle. It has lived upright on its box in its box on that shelf behind me. It's visible in many, many videos going back a year I've owned this bottle. And so it has been properly stored in the time that I've owned it, but it's much older than that. And it seems like a bottle that maybe sat on a retail shelf once it made its way to the US for several years before somebody was ready to purchase it before it made its way to me. And there's certainly a possibility that in its journey, this bottle in its box ended up, for some reason, stored on its side. Can't say. But what I can point out is that these display boxes are horrible, and they need to be phased out, especially for these high-end whiskeys. This is the second whiskey that I have owned that was more than 20 years of age and sold in one of these over-the-top, unnecessarily elaborate display gift boxes. And the problem is, this is the second one of these where I have had a problem with the cork. Now, I don't know for certain, but I will just point out that this bottle is wedged inside this rough sort of burlap lining where it's sort of stiff kind of bottle shape inside that lining to hold the bottle in place. And it needs to be wedged pretty firmly so that when you open it the first time, the bottle doesn't tip out and fall on the floor and shatter, right? It's got to be kind of in there. And there's different ways of doing this, but a lot of them have the bottle really gripped tight, including the top where the stopper is. And so as you pull the bottle out, you apply pressure to extract it. There's a tension, there's a friction. Now that this cork has been separated, I feel no tension. It pulls, lifts right out of this box. But when I first opened it, I found that the foil across the top of this cork had been sort of scraped loose. It was coming apart. Just across the middle, just where the logo or the established is. Around the edge, it was intact, but it had been sort of picked apart. Most likely to me, it seems, from the friction of pulling it out of that sort of rough, coarse material. And so there is a friction and a tension there on that cork as you're pulling it out. I don't know if that contributed to this problem. Like I said, it's an old bottle. What was left of the cork crumbled very quickly. Could have been improperly stored. I don't know for certain. What I do know is that these boxes are not helping us in any way, and I'm finding anecdotally in my own experience, with a very low sample size, that I have had a disproportionately high number of cork problems with similar packaging. Distilleries, please stop doing this. This is completely unnecessary. We're paying for it. It's expensive. It's hugely wasteful. It serves no purpose. And all of that you can maybe fine with. But maybe putting the cork stopper on your bottle at risk before you ever even take possession of it is something that none of us should not have a problem with, right? Get rid of these. Just sell us the bottle. Put it in a metal tube or cardboard tube. It's good enough for Octomore. It's good enough for Glendronach 21 Parliament. It's good enough for you. Just put it in there. Stop with these boxes. Again, I don't know. I don't know that is what happened here. In my case, I have tried to make some careful choices, minimizing any compromise for this bottle while accomplishing what I felt I had to do, which was to extract the whiskey from the cork. And so I have my long-term solution. Let me know in the comments if you have had to battle this situation, what solution that you came up with. I'm sure we'd all enjoy hearing some of these stories. What was the bottle? And in the meantime, if you enjoyed hearing my story about this journey, make sure you subscribe, hit this button that's coming up right over here, and I'll see you on the next one.